Hi guys, today I'm going to be giving you some background information on the Victorians and specifically Victoria and the Victorian people. This information will help you with your reading and study and writing about the Victorians because some really big changes happened during this age, during this era. And if you know some of the cultural context, it's going to make thinking about what you're reading a little more easy to understand. I'd like you to start first with the reading before the context sometimes so that you make up your own mind. But then I think when you go back to examine and analyze what you've read the second time, it's good to have some of that background so you understand the intended audience and purpose. So let's get right into the Victorian age and Victoria and the Victorians. So we're talking here around 1830s to the beginning of the 1900s. So we're talking about the 19th century here. The Longman Anthology sums up a lot of the paradoxes and changes that happened during this time period in a quote on page 1049 that I thought really sums it up. In the 63 years of Victorians' reign, it was marked by momentous and intimidating social changes, inventions, energies. The rapid succession of events produced wild prosperity and unthinkable poverty, humane reforms and flagrant exploitation, immense ambitions and devastating doubts. The reason that I picked up on this quote is because to me, as a Victorian scholar, I really think that this kind of just embodies all of the social and political paradoxes that are happening in the Victorian era. This was a time of just rapid change in England and in Great Britain. And scholars, when they're looking to know more about the Victorians, they always look at those paradoxes, and we'll talk a little bit about what a paradox is in a second, because that tells them more about how the Victorians not only lived, but how they thought, maybe publicly and privately, and how and what they read. So one thing that wrong way, sorry, Prezi sometimes likes to go its own way. One thing that will kind of set up where you might have been coming from in the Victorian era, the Romantic era prior, is that in the early 1800s to 1850, the population in Britain doubles from 9 million to 18 million. So in the course of 50 years, which might seem like a long time to some of you, but in the history of a nation is not a very long time at all, the population completely doubled. And part of this is because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution had already started in Great Britain before the Victorian era, and when we talk about the Romantic time period previously, we started to see the beginnings of that Industrial Revolution in the literature and in the society, with authors such as Blake talking about children working in the factories and things like that. And we'll talk about some of the negatives and the positives of the Industrial Revolution later, but because of the urban society, that created some stability to allow the population to double. This was also an age of achievement. People became even more deeper faithful and religious. It was an era of great progress for some things and an era of great wealth. Then on the other hand, it was also an age of destruction with religious collapse, materialism, and the class system being destroyed. And it really depends on who you're talking about and what part of the era you're talking about when you're looking at the Victorians to understand some of the complexities of their achievements and their destructions. One writer, Thackeray, says, "We are the time of chivalry, we are the age of steam." So there's still those ideas floating around in the Victorian era of the greatness of the days of old in England, the times of chivalry and pomp and circumstance and these really like coded social conduct rules. But there's also a lot of change. England is, at this time, a Christian nation with the Church of England, and some of the scientific discoveries that happen do frighten some of the Victorians because they have some implications that make them question their faith. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I want to make clear when I reference this that yes, there were some changes that made people question their faith, but the majority of people in the Victorian era at the beginning and at the end were still Christian and religious. I think sometimes in our book it kind of makes it read like they completely all lost their faith and no one was Christian anymore. And I think that the editor, I would take as a scholar, I would take issue with that, because while there are some big changes that happen that kind of change the way they view religion, that is just certainly not the case that everyone just suddenly were like, oh, well, we invented this, so the Church of England doesn't exist anymore. That did not happen. The Church of England still exists today. Okay, so I'll try not to get off on too much of a tangent about that, but there were some things in the text that I thought could give someone that knew nothing about England the wrong impression. At any rate, this is one example, this image that I've kind of honed in on here, of the great exhibit hall. This is the Crystal Palace in England that was built during Victoria's reign as a place where they displayed all of the great inventions of the time. And we'll talk more about the Crystal Palace in a little bit. So one of the easiest ways to look at the history of the Victorians is to kind of look at Queen Victoria's reign as a timeline and a framework. Now, we consider the Victorian period to really start in 1830, even though Victoria doesn't take the throne until 1837. And the reason is because some of the big changes that come about during her reign all start to take place in the 1830s. So let's look at Victoria's reign as a way to learn more about the British people, because Victoria grows up with Britain during her reign, and she reigns from 1837 to 1901. Now, I'm not a history teacher, I'm an English teacher, though I did have a double major in history. And there are very few dates I will actually ask you to remember, but you should remember the dates of Queen Victoria's reign. You should remember 1837 to 1901 for testing materials, because it'll be, if you don't remember those dates, it'll be hard for you to put in context some of the things that happen. So we're going to take a look here at her reign and how her development as a monarch and leader also kind of mirrors the development of the the countries in Great Britain. From her coronation when she was the fairy tale queen to her years in the 1850s when she was the fertile matron monarch, to the 1870s when she was Empress of India, or self-proclaimed Empress of India, and then towards the end of her reign and subsequent death in 1901, where people kind of looked at her as the widow of Windsor. So Victoria, here is the fairy tale queen in the 1830s. She was young and energetic and optimistic, just like the people of England were in the 1830s. There was this rising middle class. The Industrial Revolution had happened previously, but now they were really seeing the fruits of the labor of the Industrial Revolution. So they're starting to see a lot of money and goods coming into England. There's a huge economic boom, and this has also allowed for some new inventions, not only in industry, like in sorry guys, I lost my page on my notes. Let me get back there. Oh, no, sorry. Sometimes sometimes I'm not perfect. Anyways, this allowed, for, of course, manufacturing technology to increase, but there were also some other inventions, like the telegraph gets invented at this time. And now, while the telegraph might not seem like that important of an invention to people now that can carry a phone, computer, planner, communicator in their pocket, you wouldn't have one if it weren't for the telegraph. That was where installing those cables, those wires, transatlantically to be able to communicate with other countries came about. And so without the telegraph, you wouldn't have the cables that you need. Though technology has changed. And then you get Victoria in the 1850s. And this is her time period when you're seeing that fertile matron monarch, as our book calls her. She marries Alfred. She has 9 children. Her own domestic life becomes an example for other Victorians as the way that they should live and be, as a woman who is the head of her children. And you can see in some of these pictures, this is a picture of Victoria with some of her children, the ones that survived. This is the Crystal Palace, which we'll talk about more in a second. And then this is a picture of Victoria and Albert around the Christmas tree. Victoria was the person that made the Christmas tree fashionable. Albert, being from Germany, the Christmas tree was kind of a tradition there, and she had it installed to make him feel more at home. In England, this picture was drawn of the family around excuse me, this tree, and so it was in the magazines, and guess what? Everyone had to have one, and from then on, people put Christmas trees in their house. No kidding, she started that tradition. During this time, this is also when the term Victorian gets coined. This is when people started referring to people as Victorian. And it was really a description of behavior, and it signified social conduct governed by strict rules, those formal manners that we think of, that rigidly defined gender roles and class roles. That's really where this kind of takes place. That's in this part of the reign is when people start thinking of Victorian as a people. Another thing that happens in this time is the creation of the Crystal Palace, which Albert was the head of the creation of this. And it was really a testament to how far the Victorians had come, as it showed the greatness, all the inventions, etc., and this big original World's Fair of exhibits that England was contributing to the world. There's also more inventions in manufacturing technology that are happening at this time. And this is the time in the history in which Victoria and the Victorians and her Victorians are all business. I mean, the economy is booming, the middle class is getting richer and growing rapidly, and the urban city areas are starting to swell. Later on in Victoria's reign, in the 1870s, we get the time period when Victoria proclaims herself as Empress of India. And you can see from her pictures that she's definitely getting older, and she also looks pretty grumpy most of the time. This is when she was at the height of running the British Empire, which we'll talk about in some separate lectures. We'll talk about the British Empire and the imperialism. This is when she was at the height of that and her most powerful in the entire world. Several nations were British colonies. Among those were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Rhodesia, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, just to name a few. So, I mean, the British really had colonies all over the world, and we'll look at some maps and talk about that a little bit later. But this is the point in her rule where, you know, Alfred has died. She is kind of known for wearing black satin. She kind of goes downhill in terms of her figure and looks. She's very depressed and becomes very reclusive after Alfred dies. She's always in black and mourning for him. It's very austere. And the people at the same time in the 1870s really started to worry about all of these different changes that were happening in England. You know, when we look back at these times in the 1850s and 1837, these were really like kind of optimistic and energetic and happy times. But when we get into 1870s, sure that these were still great boom times for the people of England, but now this is where people are starting to say, how much is too good of a good thing? How long will this last? And they're still trying to be reflective of that. And then finally, we get to the end of the 1800s with where Victoria really becomes, you know, almost a nostalgic icon. You know, people call her the Widow of Windsor. She's definitely older. She's definitely having health problems. It's really an end of an era. But at this time, she is truly, truly universally known. For instance, oh, pardon me. So sorry, you guys. And I lost my notes. I know it so well, so sometimes I'll like not look at it, and then I'll like quit looking at it, and I'm like, oh, where did I go? Anyway, so this is really a time when, you know, because they have been such a colonial superpower, Queen Victoria is not just a national icon in Great Britain, she is a universal icon. For many people, she's on their money. And when she passes away in 1901, it's almost like the end of an era, literally the end of the 1800s, but also the end of like this idea of like English superpower, which we'll see. There's still some good days to come after 1901 in the modern period, which we'll talk about in the later on in this course. But there's also, you know, a lot of ideas are changing about, was all of this industrialization, what was it good for our people? Was imperialism good, etc. And not just negative things, positive things too. Better rights for workers, some beginnings of some rights for women. Better class mobility and things like that. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that not only is this such a big time of change in terms of technology and invention, when you talk about going from the 1830s all the way to the 1900s, because that is a really long time period for one ruler. And we talked about some of those inventions like the telegraph. By the time we get to her death, you can see that we've gone from paintings and drawings to actual pictures. And then when we get to her death in 1901, we get actual moving pictures. And one of the first things to ever be filmed in England is her funeral. And so we'll take a look here really quick at this video from British Path, which is part of the British Library, about Queen Victoria, just some clips showing some of the footage from her funeral. If it pulls up, I might have to actually go into YouTube to get this to open. Hold on, guys. Sorry. No, you don't want to try again. Oh, I love Google.
I'm just a modern chick who does what she wants. And relationships aren't my thing.
Is that one in the box? Hey, Mark
This might not be approved. Alright, just really quickly, we'll take a look at this. This will kind of, so she dies in the 2nd of February.
As the mournful tones of Chopin's funeral march sounded over the streets of London on February the 2nd, 1901, a day of much symbolism brought the Victorian era to a close. Edward VII was the new king. But as he rode in the cortege at the funeral of his mother, Queen Victoria, the empire on which the sun never set was drawing to its close. The world's greatest navy, which had contributed so much to the building of the British Empire, paid its last respects to a monarch whose reign had spanned 63 years. Victoria was just 18 when she ascended the throne. In 1840 she married Prince Albert, and when he died some 20 years later she was devastated, going into mourning for the rest of her life. Queen Victoria's funeral was the last great occasion on which almost all the crowned heads of Europe gathered together at the same time. Soon wars and revolution would be taking their toll, and the idea of monarchy itself was to be challenged everywhere. Many of her 9 children had married into other royal families in Europe. Their contacts provided a fund of political knowledge which the Queen ruthlessly exploited. This sometimes brought her into conflict with her government. 10 prime ministers came and went during her reign, some several times. But her long life and vast family connections gave the Queen an unprecedented insight into government at home and abroad. And as her coffin was taken into St. Paul's for the funeral service itself, the British public too forgave her for the years of withdrawal after her husband's death, for the social injustices that grew up through the 19th century, and joined in the universal acclaim for the grandmother of the empire.
On track here. Wouldn't be one of my lectures if something went completely correctly. Alright, so that's kind of an overview of her reign and also how England kind of grew with her. Now let's dig into some of the things I kind of teased and said, oh, we'll talk about that in a second, we'll talk about it in a second. Let's kind of dig into some of those things that will help you understand. One thing that scholars and students often say is that, oh my gosh, this is so contradictory, this is a paradox. These Victorians and Victoria, they were totally different on the surface and then what was in reality. And I call this the Victorian paradox. Just to refresh your brain, this definition from Google, a paradox is a statement or proposition that, despite sound reasoning from acceptable premises, leads to a conclusion that seems senseless or logically unacceptable or self-contradictory. A situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. And the Victorians and Victoria definitely embody this definition. On the surface, Victoria is an extremely powerful woman. She's the leader of the free world at one point, and the unfree world too. She has a very quiet, reserved dignity about her, following those very strict moral high standings of the Victorian era. She's an icon of motherhood with her 9 children, scrubbed and perfectly poised for photos and paintings, and she is one of the most recognized faces in the world, being on money everywhere. So that's her on the surface, but then reality. And we know a lot of this from her personal journals and also from statements that she made. Even though she was a powerful woman, she detested women's rights. She thought that feminists should be flogged. As a matter of fact, Queen Victoria says, "I'm most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights, with all its attendant horrors on which her poor, feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feelings and propriety." Now, we're not talking about Queen Victoria speaking out against what we as Americans sometimes stereotype as radical feminists. She's talking about women that wanted the right to be able to own a piece of property, own their own self, not marry. She's not talking about what the stereotype of a feminist has become, which I don't agree with. That's not what feminism is today at all, but what the stereotype might be. She's talking about women that were fighting for basic rights, to not be treated like property. And she thought that those people should be whipped, essentially. Even though she was the leader of the world. Not the entire world, but a lot of it. She also had this reserved dignity about her and was very prim and proper. But despite of that, she sold her image shamelessly. I mean, the woman was on everything from teacups to money to postcards. Anything that she could license her image on and sell, she did. She was this icon of motherhood with her 9 children, but she hated babies. She hated being pregnant. She hated giving birth. She didn't really like children until they were older and could speak with her, even though she encouraged everyone that they should have large families, and she did have one. And she was, again, one of the most recognized faces, but she pretty much lived in seclusion and kept to herself. She was not a person that was out and about in the world. She didn't travel very much at all. And so this is really, when you're talking about Victoria, this is some of those paradoxes that she herself, as a monarch, kind of embodied. And Victoria wasn't that much different from the Victorians themselves. The Victorians had their own paradox. On the surface, the Victorians were models of a very successful civilized society, but underneath they were extraordinarily anxious, and you see this anxiety in the literature. When you're reading the assignments for this course, think about that anxiety. Where do you see that anxiety in the readings? You know, on the surface, the Victorians were doing the gospel of good work. They felt that as evangelicals, that if they were spreading the word of God and doing through their good works, then they were being good Christians. They had a very, very wonderful sense of duty to the public in terms of what is good and what is right, and doing things to make the world a better place. They were explorers and missionaries. They felt that earning material rewards were just as important as earning spiritual rewards, and that those, if you were earning material rewards, it must be because spiritually you're doing something right. On the other hand, they were really anxious about things like fear of change, even though all of these great things are happening and changing, and the Victorians are the ones that are making them happen and change, and it's part of that material and spiritual reward. They were really, really scared about it. And some of the writers really argued that the literature of the time really, if you look at it, is almost a distraction from some of the serious issues that are happening. I really don't know if you see this, but when I'm kind of learning about it, I really see a lot of parallels with our society today. People will say, never have people been so distracted by these gizmos and gadgets that, like Facebook and social media, things like that. The Victorians kind of hid in reading and books and penny pages and magazines, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Just as I think a lot of people hide in their devices today. So you see a lot of that anxiety about overuse of these things, these new inventions in the Victorian period, bringing about some bad things. But really, the Victorians had the same sort of anxieties about those things as we do today. I mean, where in their literature they'd be talking about, kind of teasing out some of those fear of changes or fear of women suddenly getting rights. No different than you see a meme on Facebook that's talking about essentially gender roles, the same things. I mean, honestly, guys, we've been talking about the same things for as many years, just so you know. There were also some really big changes that are happening in terms of faith, even though they were a very faithful society and had like these explorers and missionaries, because of some of the scientific changes with people like Darwin and his evolutionary theories to how we date historical things. There did become some even though there was so much growth in this area of spirituality, there was a lot of doubt that kind of happened too. And we'll talk about the age of doubt in one of the other sections of materials that I give you. Even though they were willing to make all these changes, they still there was still this huge disparity. Even though they were trying to they had this duty to public good, there was a huge disparity between the very rich and the very poor, with some of the worst living conditions for the poor that England would ever know. And then gender roles of women and women's rights. They were definitely an issue then. Women were not given the votes during the Victorian period, and actually they did not get to vote until way after, during World War I. And then even voting rights for men in England were really an issue, because at the one time the middle-class Victorians really wanted people to be able, if you work hard, you should be able to move up. If you have if you have spiritual success, you should be able to have material success. But only 1 in 6 men could actually vote, and they had to be in the upper class. Some of the larger industrial cities do not even get the rights to vote in England until later in the 1800s. And these lists can kind of go on about, the different paradoxes of the Victorians. I thought this quote was really fitting from the Longman on page 1052. Few question that tremendous advances were taking place in science, public health, transportation, and the general standard of living, but each new idea or discovery seemed to have unexpected or distressing repercussions. And I really think that that's so the Victorians, and I don't know about you guys, and I'd be interested to know what you think about it, but I can really see a lot of parallels between the Victorians and our society today. The same things that they had anxiety about and people talked about and were worried about are different, but similar to some of the things that we worry about today. So some things that I want you to keep in mind as we begin to research for our assignment and learn more about the Victorians. In the research that you're going to be doing, I'll be giving you 6 key social and pardon me, next week. Excuse me, I will try to edit that out. Hopefully I can. In next week's lecture, I will be giving you 6 key social and historical issues that I will break down, and that should help you as you're brainstorming and thinking of your direction for your own research for your projects, because then I'll have like little different ones that the 6 different ones you can kind of look at and learn more about specific things. And that might help you manage like picking a topic from an entirely huge novel as well. And we'll talk more about some of the inventions and technology changes, like some of those inventions like the railway, the steam engine, electricity, religious changes. We talk a lot about how some of the scientific discoveries changed religion, but there was also a huge movement for more stringent religion. You get the rise of evangelicalism, and also like reform to the Church of England, social reforms. There was a lot of really big disparity against the rich and the poor, but in this time period, there were also a lot of laws that got passed in the Romantic period that Blake and people like that wrote about that didn't get passed, about child labor, safety, unions, those sorts of things. And then the empire as a whole, like the imperialism through the time. And then how reading and self-exploration affected art and literature of the time, because that is our main focus, not just the history. So I think that one of the quotes that I really liked from the reading came from Benjamin Disraeli, who was a conservative politician during the time, and he did serve twice as prime minister. And he said, quote, "It is a privilege to live in this age of rapid and brilliant events. What an era to consider it an utilitarian age. It is one of infinite romance." Close quote. I really think this handsome, okay, he's not handsome, this gentleman sums up, some of the great things about the Victorian era. So that should give you a little bit of an overview of the Victorian age, and Victoria and her Victorians. And like I said, next week, in our next portion of the research for your project, I will give you these 6 other pieces that will help you get started on your research when you start building your project. I hope that you find this lecture helpful, and please, if you need any help or guidance, just ask. Have a wonderful day.